Well, hello and welcome to the Hearing Health Foundation Research Webinar. This event has a live captioner and is being recorded. You can enable closed captions by clicking the CC button in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And if you need any other assistance using Zoom, follow the link to the technical guide shared in the chat. And by way of introduction, my name is Dr. Anil Lawani. I'm a professor and vice chairman for research in the Department of Otolaryngology Head and Neck Surgery, as well as associate dean for student research at Columbia University Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons in New York. I'm also a board member at Hearing Health Foundation and the head of Hearing Health Foundation's Council of Scientific Trustees. The trustees oversee the Emerging Research Grants Program, also affectionately known as ERG. Now, ERG is a competitive program that awards funds to researchers conducting cutting-edge hearing and balance research. These grants supported many leaders in our fields to become successful scientists, including Professor Anat Lubetzky, our speaker today. Now let's get to the topic of our webinar today. People with hearing loss are at increased risk for falls, believe it or not, and yet sounds are not typically included in the clinical assessment for balance, and people with hearing loss are not typically screened for balance impairments and fall risk. This may be a problem. In this webinar, Professor Anat Lubetzky will present her work creating virtual reality simulations to investigate the role of sounds in balance control. Her research points to the importance of sounds in balance control under specific environmental conditions. That is, context of your environment matters, and particularly in those with balance problems due to vestibular loss. She will also discuss a potential paradigm shift in the assessment of and rehabilitation of balance to include sound. A 2019 Emerging Research Grant Scientist, Dr. Lubetzky is an associate professor of physical therapy at New York University Steinhardt. This presentation will also cover her interdisciplinary journey into the worlds of sound and balance together with music technologists, computer scientists, and clinicians. The ERG program that provides seed money to scientists just starting out in their field of research is only possible through the generosity of supporters like you. If you would like to support our work on hearing loss, tinnitus, and related conditions, you can do so today at hhf.org/donate. And now let's go to Dr. Lubetzky's presentation. Please ask your questions through the Q&A box linked at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to answer those questions following the presentation. Professor Lubetzky.
Thank you so much for this beautiful introduction, and thank you so much for having me today. I will now share my screen. Okay. So my name is Anat Lubetzky. I'm an associate professor at NYU Department of Physical Therapy, and I'm a physical therapist in my training and a rehabilitation scientist in my PhD training. I want to thank the Hearing Health Foundation for having me today, as well as this funding from 2019, the Emerging Research Grant. And I'm going to show you today how we went about that work and how it continued our pathway into an NIH funding by the National Institute on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders in 2020 and into hopefully our next R1 award that we're working on right now. I'm going to start from my team. I have an incredible interdisciplinary team, including, as was mentioned, clinicians and scientists. So I work with computer scientists at New York University, music technologists, as well as statistician, and very lucky to have strong collaboration with the New York Eye and Ear Infirmary of Mount Sinai, and kind of those synergistic relationships have really helped this work. So, first step, let's talk about what balance is. And so, when we're thinking about standing balance, that is defined as the ability to maintain our center of gravity within our base of support. But balance is also important for movement, right? So, we should be able to stand up, move between positions, sit down without falling. And recently in the media, people have talked about balance as the ability to stand on one leg, but the truth is that balance is everywhere in life and is important across the lifespan, across different tasks. And so I put a few pictures here just to show you how it's important for acquiring motor milestones in babies and for older adults working with an assistive device, but also for high-level athletes and any movement that we want to do. Another interesting point that I want to kind of set the stage with is that balance is not one thing. It's not that I have a balance problem, I'm going to fix my problem, and then I'm going to be good to go. Balance is composed of multiple systems. And back in 2009, Professor Faye Horak kind of created this systems models for balance that includes muscle strength and range of motion that's important for balance, my ability to walk, the ability to anticipate and react to different changes in the environment. And then I want to focus on this bubble today, which is the bubble of sensory integration. And this is where I'm zooming in a little bit. When we think about sensory integration, we follow the theory of weighting and reweighting. What does that mean? Typically, historically, we think of three senses that are important for balance. What we see, or visual information, I'll talk about that a lot. Our joint position sense, which means where my joints are, how are they moving, and then the vestibular sense that is important for coordinating my head movement with my eye movement, as well as my head with my body. All of these work together and are required for stability, mobility, for function. When all are available, that's no problem. But what happens when we close our eyes, or in real life when it gets dark, or a bus is moving next to me, or I'm walking on grass? A healthy system should be able to what we call reweight, meaning I don't have enough visual information, maybe I'll switch to more somatosensory or more vestibular, and I'll remain balanced. Some people could have problems with sensory integration. So what might that look like in real life? So individuals with vestibular dysfunction, and in today's presentation, I'll show a lot of data from people who have loss of the vestibular system on one side. That means that one vestibular nerve is not functioning as well. But there are different vestibular disorders as well. These people, since they have a known sensory dysfunction, they might have a reduced ability to reweight. So in a city like New York, and you see these pictures in very busy environments, a lot of people, a lot of lights, a lot of moving targets, that might be difficult to maintain balance. And so these patients might get anxious, dizzy, off balance. And these three components are very important in those environments. And then two things might happen. They might decide to just not do it, right? And then not participate in their life activities because of that anxiety, or they might lose their balance and fall, which is obviously a big public health concern. With these, messy environments that I showed you in the previous slide, I want to show you how this is typically evaluated clinically. So, in the clinic, we simplified things. So probably the most common clinical test to look at sensory integration is what we call in physical therapy, the modified clinical test of sensory organization and balance. And in this test, we have four conditions: eyes open and eyes closed, reflecting the visual contribution to balance, and floor versus unstable surface, usually a memory foam, reflecting the contribution of the somatosensory system to balance. And then the idea is that when you are closing your eyes and standing on foam, you can only rely on the vestibular system. It's very popular in the clinic. We usually use a stopwatch just to see if a person can do it or not. And in laboratory environment, we may quantify sway. And sway is how much I'm moving while I'm standing quietly. There is some normal amount of sway, especially when we close our eyes or stand on foam, but there may be too much. There actually sometimes is even too little, but I think typically in balance research, we think of too much sway as being less stable and so more prone to falls, right? And so I'll talk about sway today, and I'll also show you different metrics that we use to quantify sway. And so we kind of brought up the idea of a paradigm shift. And where did this come from? Back in 2018, Dr. Cassetti, who is one of the collaborators I mentioned in the beginning, she works with people with hearing loss. She does cochlear implants. And she came to me and said, I want to know if my patients have balance problems. And if they do, does my surgery of cochlear implants help? That was a very surprising question to me at the time, as someone whose entire PhD was focused on sensory integration for balance, and we always thought visual, somatosensory, vestibular. We didn't really think about what we hear. And so I said, let me look into that. Let me see where the literature is on this question. And so what we saw even back then, and this is just a sample, by the way, you have the references list. There are a lot of references on this topic. This is kind of just a subset of how much literature there is on that question. There was a little bit in 2018 and so much more today. So as of today, 2025, I can tell you that hearing loss has been shown to reduce balance performance and is considered a risk factor for falls, which begs the question of what is the possible mechanism? Why are people with hearing loss at an increased risk for falls? And so one mechanism just got a request to speak a little slower. So I'll slow down a little bit. What is the possible mechanism if people with hearing loss are at an increased risk for falls? It is possible that auditory cues are needed for environmental awareness. And so if that's the case, then maybe people with hearing loss develop substitution strategies. So if sounds are required for balance and I can't hear those sounds, am I going to over rely on visual cues or somatosensory cues similar to people who have maybe vestibular loss? Or will it require more cognitive resources to maintain balance? So that is one of the theory that might explain why people with hearing loss are at an increased risk for falls. And that is the theory that I'm going to hone down on today with some of the studies we've done. So does what we hear actually matter for balance? The first step we did was we looked at the literature that was available back then. We published a review in 2020, and even then we found 28 articles about that question in standing, whether what we hear matters for balance. There have been many more since, but I want to show you a little bit what we found then and how we went about investigating and kind of filling the gaps, right? So first thing we saw is that when people used a fixed, so a static, non-moving, broadband noise, I'll explain broadband in a minute, that could be white or pink, or a static pre-recorded natural sound, so a sound of a fountain, that was associated with reduced sway. So when that sound was played, people were more stable. And that kind of suggested an auditory anchor theory, meaning I can focus on this stationary sound source and reduce my sway. Same thing we do with vision, right? You know how if you look at a stationary point in space, you could be more stable. Dancers certainly do that a lot. So I want you to hear what these sounds sound like. And I will be playing some sounds. It's going to get a little loud, but it will be short. So this is white noise. Oops. White noise, it's called broadband because it combines all audible frequencies. And what's unique about white noise, and apparently there are a lot of colors to noise, but what's unique about white noise is it combines all frequencies with equal intensities. And then there's pink noise. There's pink noise. That is, for whatever reason, not playing right now, that combines all audible frequencies, but unlike the white noise, the intensity of the noise decreases as the frequency increases, and it's kind of more similar to how the auditory system perceives sounds. The other things we saw back then is when they move the sounds, again, especially broadband sounds rather than like a single tone sound, they move them through speakers, so an array of speakers, or jump them from one side of a headphones to another. That was actually associated with more sway, with less stability. So that again supported some auditory anchor concept. That being said, it did seem like the role of auditory cues wasn't as important as vision. So the effect size may have been smaller, and some studies had no effect at all. So what we learned from that review is that the role of auditory cues seems to become more important in the presence of a sensory conflict. So, for example, standing on phone with eyes closed, like I showed you before, or a more challenging balance task, or among individuals that have some sensory loss. So this could be vestibular loss or blind. That being said, there were very few studies with what we call population of interest. Most studies were done with healthy adults. So with that in mind, this was our approach to study this. We wanted first to combine what we hear with what we see. So a lot of these studies use that eyes closed, eyes open paradigm, whereas in real life, sighted individuals combine sounds with some visual environment, right? So at the time, we were doing some virtual reality research, so we wanted to embed the sounds on some visual environments. We thought it's very important to study patients that have balance problems and then compare to healthy controls rather than focusing on healthy controls. And so as a first step, we added rhythmic broadband sound to a well-known visual paradigm, and I'll show you that in a minute. We use the HTC Vive Pro headset with the simplest headphones. So the headphones that came with the headset, we have a vision of implementing what we find in the clinic, and we thought that with a portable headset and over the years headphones that go with the headset, this will be more practical. And this is our first pilot study that was funded by the Hearing Health Foundation back in 2019. And so this is the scene. One thing I want to say, as I'm showing you some virtual reality environments with some sounds, remember that when people wear headsets, the display is in 3D, the sound is in 3D, so it's not exactly the same experience, but I wanted to give you a sense of what it was like. The visual scene that we have used a lot has the Starry Night that could be either static or moving at 0.2 hertz, which is slow, comfortable frequency of movement of visual environment at 0.032 meters, meaning you can perceive a movement, you might want to move with the scene, but healthy young adults are not going to be extremely destabilized or fooled by that. So we have used that scene, and our idea was to create a sound that's kind of scaled to that scene. We changed the amplitude in terms of the volume, so there were some volume increases, and people said it sounds like it's breathing, right? And we chose another comfortable frequency of 0.3 hertz, and then we had a kind of a paradigm. You'll see we use this type of paradigm of combination of like static visual environment, no sound, dynamic visual environment, with sound, and kind of all possible combinations. This study was published in PLOS ONE back in 2022. This was a pilot study. A lot of it was run during COVID, if you think about the timing of this work. So 12 people we tested 12 people with, as I mentioned before, unilateral peripheral vestibular hypofunction, so a disease of the nerve. And then we did have 9 people with unilateral sensory neural hearing loss. And then we had a group of healthy controls, and we measured their amount of sway both through the force platform. So here you see a participant standing on a force platform, and from the headset. The headset has an ability to detect head movement. The bottom line that's important for our trajectory tonight is that this specific sound actually had no impact at all. That the box plots were identical with sounds, without sounds. This rhythmic sound did not influence participant sway. We saw some other interesting things there. So we saw that the head, so in these figures show you directional path, so it's overall amount of sway during the scene. And on the top, you have center of pressure, so there's sway recorded from the platform. At the bottom, you have the head data, and as you can see, these figures are almost interchangeable. maybe not in numbers, but certainly in trends. And what we see here, the control group, the vestibular group, the unilateral hearing loss group, the vestibular group is higher than controls and goes higher and higher the more perturbations we added. So this is dynamic visual environment standing on foam versus static visual environment standing on the floor. And the UHL, the unilateral hearing loss group, while overall not different than control, something interesting we observed in a couple of studies was that they actually did not change with the visual changes as much as the controls did. So that was an interesting observation that we wanted to follow up on. But in terms of does what we hear matter for balance, the answer in this pilot study for this specific rhythmic sound was these sounds did not matter. So what did we do for next steps? First of all, we thought we should create a movement of the sound rather than a rhythmic sound. And so we created moving sounds as well as fully stationary sounds. The rhythmic maybe wasn't either way. We also looked at contextual sounds, so sounds that we might hear in our daily living. This time we used high quality noise canceling headphones. We still really wanted to keep studying headphones because that's more practical for clinical purposes, but we spatialized the sound so you could localize where they are. Participants were standing on foam so that the environment will be more challenging. And our questions were as follows: would moving sounds destabilize you? Would static sounds stabilize you, right? And does it depend on the visual environment? So does it matter what we see? And this was a larger project that immediately followed the pilot one, 3 years of funding from the R21 and the Early Career Award that I mentioned before. So I'm gonna show you how that went. We chose the same dynamic visual environment versus static, so our Starry Night, but this time the sounds were moving, or we created a movement of the sound. So you're gonna hear a little bit of that. And we have a little figure here that shows that the sound was moving in kind of arches around the participant's head in a random fashion. So it's almost like we would have an array of speakers, but we created it through the headphones. We also had a fully static sound, white noise, like we found in the literature, that while it was played through headphones, it was spatialized to be a little over a meter in front of the participant. So you can, so just static white noise like we heard before. And so in this study, we had 41 healthy controls, 28 participants with unilateral vestibular loss. We actually also had people with unilateral hearing loss. It just there's only so much time to present results to you today. They wore the HTC Vive headset. They observed these different combinations of scenes, static or dynamic, with or without those sounds. And they stood on foam. This is my laboratory at NYU, and the foam again was placed on a force plate. So I'll show you some of the center of pressure data. This time we recorded low and high frequency sway. So when we look at low frequency sway, it's those slow movements that kind of makes sense when you think about this type of visual environment, right? And the idea is those slow sway movements are considered cortical postural control. So this is my anticipatory planned response. Whereas we also looked at high frequency sway, which is my small corrective movements from the bottom of my feet. And each of those is quantified via what we call power spectral density. And then we had a linear mixed effect model adjusted for age, etc. So here's a quick summary of what we found. In quiet standing, by the way, low frequency sway is the major component of the variance. So this is the sway variance, this is the low frequency sway, and those figures are very similar. I have static visual environment, dynamic visual environment, and on the x-axis, I have the three different sounds: no sound, stationary white noise, and the sound that was moving around them. And now we're starting to tap into a little bit of the nuances of auditory cues and balance. So finding number one, healthy adults, even though we did include older adults too, so this is not just young, healthy adults were not influenced by sound. We started seeing more effects in the vestibular group, meaning there was a significant group by visual interaction that happened only when sounds were present. And so what you see here is that in the low frequency sway, the vestibular group was only higher than controls on dynamic visuals in the presence of sounds. So the combination of the moving visual environments and the sounds, and by the way, either type of sound. If you remember, we originally thought that the static sound will stabilize them and the moving sound will destabilize them. But it was actually a similar effect that depended more on what people were seeing at the time. So vestibular group was only significantly higher than controls when the visuals were moving and there was some sound played. So it made them in a way less stable. Even more interesting, when we looked at high frequency sway, which is where vestibular patients are almost always higher than controls, they actually used these sounds when the visual environment was static to reduce their sway and make them closer to control. So it mattered on what they saw. It also mattered on which outcome we looked at. So feel free to ask me questions about this at the end. I know it's kind of a little into the hardcore of balance analysis, but I thought this result was very interesting. So to summarize that, people with vestibular hypofunction used sounds to reduce high frequency sway when the visual environment was static, but were actually somewhat destabilized by it when the visual environment was dynamic. And so this suggests that when looking at this abstract, by the way, abstract environment, right, this starry night, and of course we use headphones, as I mentioned, auditory anchor kind of depends on the level of challenge and what people were seeing, and not so much on what type of sound it was, whether it was stationary or moving, and it had no influence on controls as well. Kind of highlights the importance of studying the population of interest, and these results are now published in Gait and Posture. There was another part to this study, which is the question of contextual sounds. And here, my incredible technical computer science and music technology team created the following environment that you will see in a second. So very clean New York City subway station, very generic people, but the sounds are perfectly scaled to what people are seeing. So it took a long time to match the sound of the oncoming train and the going away train and the footsteps. So this sounds, by the way, sounds that are recorded in a real subway station attached to graphic models. But this sounds like a real subway station. So we had that dynamic visual environment with real sounds. And then we had also the same stationary white noise that we heard before, this time with a subway environment. So this is an example for a static visual environment with static white noise, again, spatialized a little over a meter in front of the people. These were the same participants. There were 6 conditions. So the visual environment could have been static or moving, and the sound could have been none, or this stationary white noise, or these real recorded sounds, and then all the combinations. This time we looked at a more classic parameter of sway, which is called root mean square velocity. And then so higher is less stable. And we looked at it from the center of pressure, front to back, side to side, as well as head sway, all directions. So front to back, side to side, pitch, yaw, roll, and similar model adjusting for age. And I'm going to give you just a quick example of what we found here. So in these graphs, we're looking at root mean square velocity front to back in the from the center of pressure as well as from the head. We have control in gray, vestibular in black, and then static visual, moving visual environments, no sound, white noise, and real sounds. Once again, no impact of sound in healthy controls at all. But what we saw is that the vestibular group was significantly higher than controls for center of pressure only on dynamic visuals with either sound. So once we added sounds, there was a greater separation between the patients and the controls. For the head, the vestibular group usually has more head movement than controls, but adding the sounds made the difference even bigger. If you look at this picture, and this is in the front to back, but this was actually true in other head directions as well. Look at how the level of separation it creates. So that was an actual main effect of sound here, meaning the vestibular group, when the visuals were moving, had more movement with the contextual sounds versus no sounds. So what are we learning from that? Once we added auditory stimuli, that was more with a contextually accurate sound, so this recorded sound of the subway, but we actually observed it to a certain extent, even with the white noise. That increased postural and head sway in people with vestibular hypofunction, but not in healthy controls. So the between group differences were magnified where sounds were present. And so in this specific context, white noise did not function as an anchor, but actually as an additional perturbation. That was not what we hypothesized. That's part of the magic of research. I think I mentioned before, the past literature primarily had eyes open, eyes closed paradigms. There weren't a lot of studies that looked at how sounds are combined with different visuals. And so scientifically, this suggested the involvement of sounds in posture control, which is the topic of today's webinar, is much more context dependent than other sensory input. I don't have so much it depends when we talk about visual changes for balance. And it does suggest, I think, that clinicians should start incorporating contextual sounds into their evaluation of balance in patients with sensory integration deficits. And that today is not done at all. These findings are going to appear soon in PLOS ONE. We just did the proof for this paper. In the last few minutes that I have, I wanted to show you another really cool study that we did. All the results that I showed you so far looked at static balance, so that's standing people and looking at their sway. We also built a dynamic balance task, so we call it a ball avoidance paradigm. People are standing on the floor and a ball flies towards their head, and they need to move outside of their base of support and return to center without losing their balance to avoid that ball. In this specific study, once we developed this system, we included only healthy young adults, and we told them avoid a ball and return to the center after every ball. Each scene was 60 seconds long. Each had 4 15 seconds wave, and the difference between the waves was how quickly the balls were showing up. Our idea when designing this was that we'll see most of the differences on the last waves when the balls are coming really quickly. First, it was 2 to 4 seconds interval. It ended with like 1 second interval between balls. And so this protocol had a few different conditions. The baseline condition had 2 color balls, red or blue. And we told them, so you see, this is an example for what a participant was saying, avoid a ball. If it's red, move to the right. If it's blue, move to the left. And we change it sometimes just so that they don't get used to it. So that was the baseline. Then we added two different sounds. The sound could have been helpful, what we called congruent, meaning if the participant had to dodge to the right, this a two-tone sound came from the right side, whether a headphone or a speaker. And then we told the participants the sounds will indicate the correct direction to which you should move. Then we had a scene of what we called incongruent or distracting sound, where the sound had no connection to where they were supposed to go. Same type of sound as two-tone sound, but it could have come from anywhere. And so we said the sounds may or may not indicate the correct direction to which you should move, and we measured reaction time and accuracy from the headset. Our hypothesis, like before, if sounds are involved in balance, we expected helpful sounds to help, meaning make people faster and make them more accurate. At the same time, we expected distracting sounds to distract, right? Make people slower and then maybe make them less accurate. And the magic of research happens in the discrepancy between what you hypothesize and what you actually found. So let's start from reaction time. Obviously, lower is faster. What we saw was that participants reacted significantly faster with sound, either sound, distracting or helpful. That was true with headphones. That was true with speakers too. Um, Another interesting thing is that we only observed the differences in the first two waves. I think the faster waves were so fast that there wasn't any room for change. This is the quiet scene. This is the helpful sounds. This is the unhelpful sounds. And you can see that people are faster on the first two waves with either type of sound. Even more interesting is the accuracy picture. And when I saw this, it kind of organized in my mind a lot of the other results as well. Remember, these are healthy young adults, right? So healthy young adults can choose what they can use or what they shouldn't use. And so this picture shows accuracy. If I have no clue, I'll be at 50%, right? Because it's a 50-50 choice, which direction I should dodge if I went to the right when I was supposed to go to the right. And so this is their accuracy when there are no auditory cues. With the helpful auditory cues, participants became significantly more accurate. With the unhelpful cues, it didn't change at all. So basically, what we saw with the healthy young adults, when we told them the sounds will indicate the correct direction, they embraced it. But when we said the sounds may or may not indicate the correct direction, they just said, okay, so I'll ignore the sound and use the visual cues only. And that's another support to kind of the context in which we need to think of sound and balance. This study was actually funded by a seed award from the NYU Music and Audio Research Laboratory, and we have several publications where we show the development of this work and the results. And we actually ran 2 studies and kind of showed the replication aspect. And so let's put it all together and start a discussion. Does what we hear matter for balance? Yes, but it depends. It depends on the task. It needs to be a task that's challenging enough. It does depend on what we see. It depends on who we are testing. We can't just keep testing healthy adults. We need to test the people of interest and see how they respond to this. Healthy can use it, but they have a lot of reserves. So as you can see in the other studies, they weren't affected by disturbing sounds, right? But patients with known balance problems may be more affected. And as a last point, because this presentation was very much about sounds, but I want to bring us back to people with hearing loss. In some other work that we've done, we saw that the impact on balance was more pronounced in bilateral rather than unilateral hearing loss, but there are many questions remained. I focus today on access to sound as a possible mechanism explaining this link, but we know that the relationship between hearing loss and falls is more complex than that. There may be attention issues, cognition issues, physical activity and exercise in general. And so our next step in an R01 proposal that we've submitted right now is to study which of these mechanisms is most important, or are they all kind of interact together, as well as to investigate whether hearing aids with or without an exercise program can modify the risk and through what mechanism. And with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I'm excited to take your questions and have a discussion.
Well, Professor Lubetzky, that was amazing. Really, a lot of data, and we do have some question related to hearing loss and balance, some related to tinnitus and balance, and some related to what happens if you intervene with hearing aids and CI, much like the focus of your R01 application, it sounds like. There was a technical question. I'm just going to go ahead and ask it first. I don't think we have to spend a lot of time on it, but did you test people with both unilateral hearing loss combined with vestibular dysfunction, or just unilateral vestibular hearing loss in isolation and unilateral hearing loss in isolation?
Great question. The results that I presented, the people with vestibular loss had normal hearing, tested normal hearing, confirmed through audiogram. And we also had, I did not report a lot of results from the people with unilateral hearing loss. These people had no dizziness. So we separated these conditions. And that is a big part. It's actually it's a technical question, but it's actually conceptually a very important one scientifically, because as we're trying to understand how hearing and vestibular sense contribute separately to balance, it was very important for us to make sure that the vestibular patients had normal hearing, that the hearing loss patients had normal vestibular function. So we could, of course, clinically, we see a lot of the combination, but scientifically, it's important to understand them as separate entities.
Um, that's terrific. And when you look at the type of hearing loss, have you looked at conductive versus sensorineural? Because, conductive just is probably volume issue, whereas a sensorineural may be an inner ear issue. Any thoughts on that? Any data, or what are your thoughts about that?
Yes, we would love to. So it's a really interesting question, because when you look at some of the old literature about the connection between hearing loss and balance, there's a lot of these sub questions that have not been answered. And so we need to start kind of systematically decipher each one of them, right? We have been focusing on sensory neural hearing loss. There haven't been a lot of studies regarding conductive hearing loss. Sometimes in the literature, people mimic conductive hearing loss by blocking, putting earplugs in healthy, controlled ears. That's not the same as having conductive hearing loss. So most of what we know so far is primarily focused on sensory neural hearing loss.
Got it. One of the findings of the context-specific sounds that was a little worrisome, I guess, in some ways, unexpected finding for your work, which was that it wasn't helpful. And in fact, it led to more sway when they had that subway noise with visual movement and so on.
Right.
As you think about that, what's the implication for intervening with hearing aids then? Because all that will just make things louder in context-specific way. Your thoughts about
But context has many layers, right? So in addition, I love this question. In addition to the context of the environment, you also have to think about the context of the people, right? Because think about, let's look at the whole thing. Healthy controls were not influenced by it at all. It was people who had vestibular loss that are known to be sensitive to moving visual environments. And then we kind of expanded the myths, right? And created a real moving auditory environment. So that's one point. That doesn't mean that we can take these results and say, okay, so if people with hearing loss hear these sounds, they'll be more unstable, right? Because that was specific to vestibular loss. Another point that I want to kind of clarify a little bit, the auditory anchor theory suggests that stationary sound sources may help my balance, and moving sound sources may disturb our balance. The surprising finding in the R21 work that I presented was that stationary sound source didn't actually function as an auditory anchor, right? They also, in certain circumstances, increase sway. And so we definitely need to look at that deeper. Is it because it was through headphones rather than speakers? I didn't go into, there's a lot of technicalities that go into designing these paradigms. When we say we want to look at it with headphones because that's more easily implemented in the clinic, but is it how we hear real sounds in real life? Not exactly, right? Because when I hear it with headphones, it's kind of through my head, whereas the real environmental sounds come from the environment. The other study that I mentioned actually had a speakers paradigm as well. So, and some literature had speakers and some headphones. So I think it's important to think about the hardware and how the sounds were played as well. And finally, this was a standing task, right? We need to also think about what's happening in walking. So I don't want people to conclude from that study that, oh, we should just block out sounds because sounds make us unstable, right? Moving visual environments can also make us unstable, but we're still safer when we see the visuals around us. So interesting question for sure.
There were several questions about people that have tinnitus, sort of the kind of a constant noise.
Yes.
Any data or any work that you've done on the impact of tinnitus on balance issues?
Yeah, nothing that I can say specifically. Some of our patients did have tinnitus, but not to a level that I'm able to separate. The study wasn't powered to study tinnitus. We just didn't want to exclude people with tinnitus. And so certainly patients complain about that. I don't have, nor from the other literature, a specific focus on how tinnitus influences balance separately from vestibular loss and hearing loss, other than maybe these patients. So one thing, maybe they're more sensitive. So one thing, for example, again, one of those details I didn't talk about, the loudness of the sound. We started at a certain level and said the sounds need to be the loudest that's still comfortable. And so we changed it a little bit for every person, right? And I think those with tinnitus tend to be more sensitive and kind of ask for a quieter sound. But I don't necessarily have evidence that louder sound influences, and we actually looked at it back then in the review. There wasn't evidence that loudness is an important feature in balance so much. But that was just a long answer to say that there isn't a lot of evidence on balance, and we are all, we understand the problem, and I've seen a lot of patients that suffer from this, and certainly really important.
Yeah, so next question is sort of a two-part question, but I think it is asking something very fundamental and is aligned with the kind of work you're doing and what you're planning to do. Um, so John Taylor asks, controlling for a degree of hearing loss, do people with hearing aids or implants generally have better balance? That's the first limb of that. The second is it the actual loss of sound that matters, or do the problems in the cochlea still affect balance? So I guess, in some ways, is it the auditory information coming in, or is it the inner ear that's a problem, or both? Take it away.
This is almost like aim one and aim two on my proposal. This is exactly right. That's exactly the question. So I'll tell you what we know and what we still need to know in just a few minutes. There hasn't been a randomized clinical trial looking at the effects of hearing aids or cochlear implant on balance. There have been a lot of cross-sectional studies. So cross-sectional studies look at on-off, right? I'm looking at certain paradigm of balance with my aid or with my implant or without it. There have been some longitudinal non-randomized studies. The literature is inconsistent, and there are certainly studies pointing either way. Some studies showed that, with hearing aids, balance is better. Some did not. One thing that the reason we believe that a randomized trial is crucial here is that when you study people who are already users of hearing aids, there are several other factors that you might not control for, right? Um, Maybe their balance has already gotten better over time because there are hearing aid users. And so just taking their balance for 1 hour is not a good reflection of their condition. Maybe one thing we saw is that in another study, our hearing aid users that also had, by the way, there was a question there about severity of hearing loss. So the hearing aid users in the study that we had also had worse hearing, right? Because people with worse hearing are more likely to pursue hearing aids, but they were also the rate of exercise was 100% in that group. So that was a group that was very well aware of their health, very interested in health, very physically active. So each one of these factors relate to what it means to live with a hearing aid. And to look at the second question, I absolutely don't think it's only what we hear. And that's another problem with studies that look at on, off in some sort of a sound paradigm. We're missing a lot of the other factors, right? And so we think it's important to look at all of these factors: access to sound, physical activity, cognition, attention, psychosocial factors. All of these relate to falls too, by the way, right? Even if we take the hearing out of it, right? Just thinking about falls, physical activity, psychosocial factors, right? So we need to look at all of this, and we think it should be randomized so that you eliminate those possible confounders. That, to summarize, there have been studies about this question, but there isn't a conclusive answer. There's a lot of it depends on what they tested and so on.
Um, you suggested that there may have to be a paradigm shift in how we think about these people with balance problems, and specifically incorporating sound into the evaluation. Um, what does that involve actually? What are we going
Yeah.
to be doing differently, or what should we be doing differently that we're not doing now in the evaluation of these patients?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for this question. This to me has two main facets. Number one, while the mechanism for the relationship between hearing loss and falls is not fully clear. We have several theories. I actually think that all of them, I don't, sometimes we like in science to kind of choose a theory and go with it. But when we work with people, it's usually a combination of factors. So while it's not fully clear if there's a number one factor, we know that hearing loss increases the risk of falls. And yet people with hearing loss are not screened for their balance. They're not, they don't get full prevention programs which we have for other populations. So screening of balance, asking about falls, asking about confidence in balance, this is something that there's enough literature to suggest that implementation that requires synergy between different disciplines, right? Like we do in our facility. So audiologists, physical therapists, physicians need to work together to make this happen. The other piece of it is looking a little more specifically in how we measure balance, suggesting that different sounds, that may be a little more complex to do because you need to decide, okay, which sounds should I use, and can we implement virtual reality assessments in the clinic? Is the technology, that's kind of another line of research. How do you transfer this technology into a clinical setting, and the technology keeps evolving, and we want to get something that's accurate enough but easy to use and not too expensive. So we believe that these different types of sounds should be incorporated in different balance tests, right? And that's the work of kind of the physical therapists and rehabilitation professionals to validate these tests, so I can give you a more accurate answer of, okay, everybody that comes to a balance clinic, here is the test that you should use to see how they respond to this interaction between visual and auditory load. I think that interaction is really important.
It almost, I think, extension of your work might be that you need to address both hearing and balance, that they're not occurring in isolation. There's interaction among those. You shouldn't think about it in isolation. Is that a message I should walk away with after your talk today? Not that we know all the answers in every aspect of what those relationships are. What are
Yes.
your
And
thoughts?
we should that we should think of hearing and balance, and it has another level. I think from as a physical therapist, right? From a physical therapy perspective, physical therapists usually will not see people with hearing loss unless they're dizzy, right? They will be referred to physical therapy, to vestibular rehabilitation clinic if they're dizzy. But the fall risk can be there even if they're not, right? And we actually published work that showed this was in people with unilateral hearing loss, that maybe they had more positive vestibular testing, say caloric quickness, but they weren't dizzy, and that their balance performance was not related to that, to having a positive or negative caloric test. So that's one point. With that being said, a lot of people with hearing loss come to the doctor because of their hearing, and they may actually be dizzy. But if you don't ask them, they're not going to say. So, and I can say that because as we started screening patients for our study, and in our study, people with hearing loss had to be without dizziness, right? Because that's part of that scientific isolation that we mentioned. A lot of people couldn't participate because they were dizzy, and the doctor didn't necessarily know that. If they didn't screen them, they didn't come and say, "Hey, I'm dizzy," right? So it's these two different layers, but the bottom line, gotta ask people with hearing loss about their dizziness, about their balance confidence, and have some balance screen so that we can reduce falls in this population already, while science is doing its job to find the mechanism and the right interventions, and how hearing aids can help and how exercise can help and so on.
Well, Professor Anat Lubetzky, that was an amazing, amazing presentation. Thank you for all the questions. I apologize to many of you in our audience whose questions I did not get to, but thank you all for your attendance, and Dr. Lubetzky for this very informative presentation. We're so grateful to you, our community, for your support of our Emerging Research Grants Program. You should know that the application for the next cycle of grants are open and due Monday, March the 3rd. So if you're interested in emerging research grant, please do get your applications in. You can check at the hhf.org/ERG for emerging research grants for information. And remember that you can donate to our efforts to advance better treatments and cures for hearing and balance conditions at HHF, that's Hearing Health Foundation, hhf.org/donate. Thank you, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.